Sylvia and me.
Sylvia and
Sylvia and me. Sylvia and
Sylvia.
me.
Sylvia and me.
Sylvia and Sylvia.
There was a timeless quality to the story about a very memorable time in classical music history, 30s, 40s, 50s. And so I thought, but what else can I do to make it actually more personal? And my father in the book narrates in the first person, but he doesn't reveal much about himself. So I said, aha, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce each chapter with an essay of my own, telling a little more about my dad, bringing him a little more center stage, because it all dovetails with Toscanini and his career, but also what it was like for me growing up in a home filled with music.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Beckerman, host of the podcast series Sylvia and Me, conversations with inspiring, empowering women.
Hello, I'm Lucy Antek Johnson, and I'm thrilled to be the me of Sylvia and Me today, talking about my favorite subject. This Was Toscanini, the Maestro, My Father and Me, which was published as a hardcover in 2021 and has now come out as an audio, I'll call it an audio experience. I am by background a television producer and executive. I do paint, I do play an instrument, but I have taken up memoir writing in the last decade or so and decided that my major project, which is a labor of love, it was going to be a tribute to my dad, who was the first violinist with the NBC Symphony under the legendary baton of Maestro ArturoToscanini, who was in his day considered the greatest musician of the modern age. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, Lucy. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you.
Well, as you said, we're going to talk about the audio experience, the audiobook of This Was Toscanini, the Maestro, My Father and Me. It's narrated by you and also the actor David Garrison, and it's quite telling that it was recorded in a studio not far from either one of us, the Westport studio, the Verso Studios at the Westport Library. I want to start off by, you mentioned what your father had done with Toscanini. I want to read two pieces that I think are very telling. I guess what we should really do before I jump into something is the fact that this book that you actually expanded on in 2021 in hardcover was an expansion of a book that your father started on Toscanini. He was asked to do this, and he never got a chance to finish it because, unfortunately, he suddenly passed away at a very early age, at the age of 48. And the original book was actually, the manuscript was finished by your mother, who did not expand on it. She left it wherever your father had left it off, but she chose pictures. And as you mentioned, Toscanini was and still is looked at as one of the greatest or the greatest musician. And what I want to do is talk about, go into why you thought that now was the right time, or the time, you never know when a right time is, to actually do what you did, which is take your father's notes, his journals, your mother's journals, from what I understand, and expand on what you thought your father would have wanted more into the story. So, as I said, I want to read two pieces. One was written by your father, Samuel Antek, and the second was, I believe, written by you, considering the words "my father's book" is in there. So your father writes, Playing with Toscanini was a musical rebirth. The clarity, intensity, and honesty of his musical vision, his own torment, was like a cleansing baptismal pool. Caught up in his force, your own indifference was washed away. You were not just a player, another musician, but an artist, once more searching for long forgotten ideals and truths. You were curiously alive, and there was purpose and self-fulfillment in your work. It was not a job, it was a calling. And that is, it says everything for anyone who is, especially a musician and artist, that passion that your father pulls through in talking about and writing about Toscanini. And then you wrote, first published in 1963, my father's book remains the most comprehensive personal narrative about working with the maestro. It is a story about the passion and dedication it takes to make great music and about Toscanini's singular and often volatile approach to music making. It is also a story about the formation of a new orchestra under the baton of a musical genius who not only was a force throughout his 20th century career, but who possessed an artistry and style that resonates even now, more than 65 years after his last concert. Wow.
Thank
I
you.
mean, really, wow. Because
May I show you the book?
of course you can.
Okay. This is the hardcover. I'm trying to do, and the audiobook cover looks the same, but the photograph and what makes the hardcover so special too is that these photographs, which have now become iconic to anything to do with Toscanini and first introduced in 1963, were done without his knowledge during hundreds of rehearsals, recording sessions, and performances. So I just want to kind of say there's a great difference between the audiobook and the printed book. They both offer something special and unique.
Well, the audiobook, I believe, because what you did, considering an audiobook, you can't show pictures, just like on a podcast. If anyone's listening to just the audio, they wouldn't be able to see the pictures. But what you've done is you've taken pieces of the symphony and you've inserted them, replacing the pictures, so you can close your eyes and hear the music. You can really get yourself totally involved, not just from the narration, but the music itself, and get this unbelievable experience.
Oh, how nice to hear. Yes, I figured, knowing you couldn't use photographs in an audiobook, and not just wanting it to be the text, saying music is what we're talking about, music is what we should be hearing. And I arranged with the estate to get permission to use a certain amount from original performances of the NBC Symphony and inserted them, sometimes leading you into a chapter or leading out, and quite often as cues within the chapter, like you would use illustrations in a book to elevate the text with an example, such as when my father's words, or in this case, David's narration, when the maestro yells out Brahms, because he's in rehearsal, the listener hears an excerpt from Brahms first, which was in fact the first rehearsal for the first concert the NBC Symphony ever gave. And this actual recording is from that time.
With what a new, fierce joy we played. So, he bellowed. Cantare, sostenere. His legs were bending slightly as he braced himself for his violent movements, which were becoming larger, more pile-driving as the music reached its first great climax. Cantare, sostenere. I was to hear these words often in the years to come. Sing, sustain, Toscanini's battle cry.
Now, what year are we talking about? Let's tell our readers
Well,
this.
we can think way back. The orchestra was formed in 1937 by RCA, which then owned NBC radio network, and lasted for 17 years till 1954, when Toscanini, at age, a lot of numbers here, at age 87, retired. So for 17 years, they were a leading orchestra around the world, but mostly because it was on radio every week. These broadcasts were broadcast throughout the world. And when Toscanini, at age 70, was invited to create this orchestra and start this new adventure and business venture for RCA, he was already 70 years old. And it was just at a very tender time for him. He certainly had the energy and the interest and the passion. That wasn't going at all. But he had to leave Italy because he had stood up to Mussolini and he had stood up to Hitler at a very, very hard time in Europe just prior to World War II. And he was being hurt by the fascists, and they weren't going to harm him, although they did a pretty good job of denying him his rights and beating him up along the way. But when he got this invitation, it seemed just the perfect opportunity to leave his homeland, which he didn't get back to till after the war, and come to America. And my dad was among all the orchestra members. They were all handpicked to be part of this new orchestra. And my dad was with it from day one till the last performance. So.
And you have allowed us, really, by doing this, it's like a memoir within a memoir. I think you also said that. You've taken us into your family as well, because we get to know your father as well as, I don't know if you call Toscanini his mentor or just, I mean, it's like they were teachers on, excuse me?
He was a major influence, as he was to probably many of the musicians. But yes, it was an unofficial mentorship.
So why did you feel that this was a time to re-release an expanded edition? First, of course, the hardcover. Why in 2021? What?
Well, actually, what happened in 2017, which I think of as yesterday, but it's already a few years ago, it was the 150th anniversary of Toscanini's birth. And with that round number came a lot of articles and a lot of editorials and attention to the maestro and his legacy. And quite often, my dad's book, which had been published years before and still was considered a classic, was quoted. Passages were quoted. And I said, not only was I pleased and surprised, but I said, I'm going to reread this because I haven't read it for decades. And I sat down and I read it, and I not only was moved, but realized actually what a good writer my dad was. And as one of the reviewers had said, he was as good a writer as he was a musician. And I said, I have to put this out again. This is timeless. There was a timeless quality to the story about a very memorable time in classical music history, 30s, 40s, 50s. And so I thought, but what else can I do to make it actually more personal? And my father in the book narrates in the first person, but he doesn't reveal much about himself. So I said, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce each chapter with an essay of my own, telling a little more about my dad, bringing him a little more center stage, because it all dovetails with Toscanini and his career, but also what it was like for me growing up in a home filled with music. So my intention, my goal, I hope I've succeeded, is to ultimately lead the listener to my dad's chapter, which is the meatier part about Toscanini, but I do it in a very personalized way.
Yes, you do. And it just adds so much to the story because, as you said, you were only 12 when your dad passed.
Yes, yes.
And yet you have so many memories, and I'm sure that I'm not going to assume because we know what that does. But tell me about reliving and maybe even reconnecting with your
Well, that's the
father.
best word of all, was the reconnection, because when I started to do research, because I went through all his papers, all the boxes in the basement, all the archives that I had donated to Lincoln Center Library for the Performing Arts of my dad's archives. Of course, I had looked through this, but never with this focus. So when I spent hours and hours and hours going through the letters and the photographs and the articles and the interviews, etc., the memorabilia, I first of all saw it with new eyes and got very, very emotional, because here I am, an adult woman, looking back at a time when I was a very impressionable young girl. And what a difference to reconnect with him on such a, for me, profound level as an adult, and find a whole new relationship to him as an adult woman, not just the 12-year-old girl who was, of course, he was my idol, of course. And so that was probably the most profound part of this whole experience. Looking at a photograph that I had over my lifetime seen many, many times, but it had whole new meaning. Finding letters that I had never really paid that much attention to. And all of a sudden it was in his words, or my mother's words, because she wrote journals too about their many of their experiences with the symphony. So it got personal, it got moving, it was emotional. And I also connected to the maestro, who was an icon to me. His picture was on the piano as a kid, and it's still there today, right in my living room on the same piano. Felt like I got to know him, and I got a very soft spot in my heart for him, because he was a complicated man. And I'll never be able to have a conversation with him, never would have anyway. But I feel like now I could almost sit down, not to talk music, I wouldn't presume to do that, but just to be in Toscanini's presence would have been thrilling for me, especially now. So it was twofold, and it becomes a tribute to these two musicians, and it's a musical love story.
It definitely is, because as is recounted, not all of the rehearsals, some of them were brutal. And when I say brutal, Toscanini had such passion and he was so focused, and he wanted the musicians to play from the heart. And yet every single one of those musicians stayed. They took whatever, when I say brutal, the words, the shouting, and we have pictures. When we think of an orchestra conductor, we think of them, pounding and really, and from the telling, from what your dad had written, the rehearsals could be brutal. So you're talking about the respect that these musicians had for this genius had to be immense.
And unexpected in a way. Certainly they came to this moment, he came to this moment. They knew who he was world renowned, and he had conducted all over the world and commanded hundreds of thousands of people buying tickets to concerts, because that's what people did in those days. We didn't have all the the opportunities we have now. But in the quote that you used from my father, it brought out the artist in them. So they might have bristled when Toscanini got a little angry and might have flung some Italian curses at everybody, but they realized and really appreciated that it was all in the service of the music. He wanted it to be right. He wanted it to be what he heard in his head, as well as what was on the page by the composer. So he could be a pretty tough taskmaster, but I think from my understanding of all this, he was as much of a taskmaster of himself, and the anger was frustration because he wasn't hearing what he wanted to hear. So it turns into anger or incidents, but the musicians, they bristle, of course. They didn't want to be in the line of fire. You didn't want to be in the line of fire, although at one point my dad is. You play that alone. But they felt that it brought out an artistry in them that they didn't even know they had. And these were virtuoso musicians that handpicked from all over the world, really. So they were not new to this, but they were new to this particular experience.
Well, one of the other facts that your dad, talks about is the fact that Toscanini knew all the scores by heart, but he did not rely on that, because when it came time to actually perform or rehearse, he played with the heart. He kept being inspired by the score, and his thing was it was for you to interpret the composer's work. It was a task that you needed to do properly.
Well, also, if you're a violinist who is doing solo concerts, or you're a French horn player, or you're a cellist, it doesn't matter, and you're used to doing solo, you're interpreting and you're alone up there. And of course, there's an orchestra behind you, but you're the spotlight. When you're in an orchestra, there has to be a unity. And Toscanini, in this case, and most prominently in this case, it's like if a director of a movie or a play, the director is in charge of all creative elements coming together and being the vision, whether it be the words on the page, the actors in the case of a play, the look of it, the lighting of it, the sound of it, the tone of it. That's what Toscanini and any conductor is doing. They are like a director, if you want to put it in more familiar terms. And so he wanted to always make sure that the orchestra was united in this vision. Look to the score, play with your hearts. Because if anyone was interpreting on their own, they were throwing it off for everybody else. So that was difficult for some of these musicians who are used to playing solo, but they got used to it. But that was his mantra, so to speak, along with cantare, sostenere, sing, sustain. He was very descriptive and very humble, actually. He was very shy, believe it or not, with all these little tantrums and with all the brilliance and fame. He saw that he was a vessel to bring this music as any of these composers intended. And that was so important to him. And that's where a lot of the frustration came from, because it wasn't happening the way he heard it in his head.
Well, that was a huge job for him. That was a huge, I don't want to say the word burdens, the thing that comes to my mind right now, but it was huge. He needed to accomplish this. He felt he owed it, from what I read, to the composers of this music. And so he wanted to get it as perfect as he could.
Right. And when you don't have Brahms sitting next to you to say, a little slower, please, you have to you have to have that, I wouldn't say burden, a responsibility.
That's the word. Thank you.
And
Retrieval.
also as a musician, because he was a trained cellist and then conductor, he knew how, or he certainly had his way. And there were other conductors at the time. George Zell, at the time, Cleveland Symphony, would say that Toscanini was a truth teller. There was before Toscanini and after Toscanini. It's like there are two different eras. And that's where, some people, musicians, this book and this audiobook is good for anyone who likes music. It's a behind the scenes look. It's not a biography, although it tells some tales of his life. It's a behind the scenes look of the creative process. How does a great artist, and great artists timeless, how does a great artist work on their work until it's delivered, whether in a concert or in a recording? If we were to be lucky to be in the studio of Matisse, the same thing, there'd be sketches on the floor, the things thrown away. Well, that's what rehearsals were about. And that doesn't mean he was rigid, because he might have a piece that 2 years later, he might just make it slightly faster or just change the tempo at this point. But tempo and rhythm are really in the hands of the conductor and the musician, because I don't know if you know much, but 4/4 time can be, it's still 4 beats to the bar, but it isn't necessarily all the same. If you did it and I did it, we might be counting differently. So it still comes down to his interpretations of what the composer intended. So it was the rehearsals. So, and I remember hearing the stories at the dinner table. I didn't know they would turn into a book or a series of articles that my dad had written originally. Toscanini was such a presence in our house, even though he did not visit us. But the rehearsals, as intense as they might be, were often more relaxed, because he knew he could do it again, or let's try that again, or let's go back 16 bars, or whatever the leader does in a case like that. Whereas once you're on a recording,
That's it.
it's on the recording. And no matter how many takes they might have done, he was never satisfied. He always said, oh, I could have done it better. And maybe he could have, maybe not. But once it's done, it's done. So he's primarily heard now through the recordings. And I have no idea how he would feel. It would be very, I wonder what he'd think all these years later, almost 100 years of this symphony later. Wow, they're still playing my stuff.
Well, one of the things now that I'd like to kind of get into as we're winding down is you come, of course, from a very music, art-oriented family. And you did ballet, you did art, and then you didn't want to be in center stage, as you said. And one of the things that your parents were they instilled in you is don't be afraid of change, try new things, and find what you love. And you had a love for creating and shaping programming. You wanted to be behind the scenes. And that's exactly what you did. And you wound up at NBC cataloging in your first job.
The record library, yeah.
And you were using the same elevator that your father and Toscanini used when they went to the NBC studios for the symphony.
Right. And
how cool is that?
It was really cool. Studio 8H, which we now know as Saturday Night Live studio, was originally created from a radio studio into this orchestra space for recording and for the concerts. So it's the same stage, so to speak. And by the time I got to NBC, working the lowly little typist in the record library. First of all, I thought it was the most thrilling thing that had ever happened. I was in show business at last. But also I was walking, you're right, the same elevators, walking down the same hallways in happens to be a gorgeous building, the RCA building. And that, as I wrote about it, not just lived it, but as I look back on those years, I went, wow, I came full circle. I didn't intend that. I didn't know that was going to happen that way. But yes, to quote Lin-Manuel Miranda, I always wanted to be in the room where it happened. And for me, television production, although I love radio, love radio drama and talk shows and music and so forth, teamwork and everybody joining together with their special skills to make a product was very exciting to me. And I wanted to be behind the scenes of making things. So that's how that all came about, as well as the Dick Van Dyke Show, because that was watching that. And if anyone remembers when the original Dick Van Dyke Show,
yeah.
He was a writer on a television show. That was his profession. And we, the audience, would be part of their creative team working out the script and the jokes, and also being scared of their boss. And I kept saying, I want to be in that room. I want to be one of those people one day doing that. And I did it. I did.
You were producing movies for television before joining the ranks of NBC as a network executive, and then you worked your way up to senior VP of daytime and children's programs for CBS. Lucy, I want to ask you, what do you hope people will get from this book? And are you hoping to maybe be able to touch some of the younger people who, unfortunately, music has been taken out of so much of the curriculum, and not, there's not a wide range of music that many young people listen to. I was watching a very old movie, The Quartet.
Oh, it's not that old.
Oh, no, it's not. It's about 10 years old.
Right.
And the professor was talking to a group of young people about how opera, telling a story of opera, and rap were really telling the same story, just in a different way. So what would you like people to get out of this?
Well, first of all, this audiobook is for anyone who loves music. You'll enjoy. I don't care what age you are or what your experience is. If you have some experience studying music, whether you're a professional musician or a student, it has that much more impact for you. But you can lose yourself happily, in a pleasant way, lose yourself in stories. I love being told stories. So this is storytelling with musical illustration of a time that was very prominent in classical music, but also, as I said before, is timeless, because great art is timeless. So when you're behind the scenes, experiencing and my dad brings you into this orchestra, almost experiencing as they experienced what was going on. You, the listener, have that same chance. And you get to be at one with a creative genius and how he and they created their art. And it's a pleasure too. There's a nice pleasure to it all, but you will walk away feeling closer to the creative process.
Well, I definitely agree. Where can people find out more about you?
About me, or where can they find the book?
Well, both.
Okay. Me, I'm you've kind of told my background. I suppose you could Google me and look at
Okay,
different
so
things. that I
where
do.
can I find the book?
But the book is on all audiobook platforms, Audible, Spotify, Barnes and Noble, Chirp, which I had never heard of, but I guess it's a big thing. Google Play, Apple Books, all the places. Now, you have to get the apps and then you have to download, but most people know how to do all
Yes.
this now. And I've been listening to audiobooks for decades, so I love audiobooks. But that's how it is. It's a digital download on any audio platform.
Okay, so it's This Was Toscanini, the Maestro, my father, and me. Lucy, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure.
Well, Sylvia, a real pleasure for me. And I'm so glad that we're that physically, geographically close to one another. And I will probably now see you all the time in Stop and Shop. And now I'll know who you are.
Thank you. You can find us on all of your popular podcast platforms. And of course, our website, sylviaandme.com. Stay safe, stay healthy, and as always, stay tuned.